Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our For Real This Time last session of the day, where we're going to do a bit of open Q&A and AMA, AMA within reason, as we always say. But yeah, so I actually brought in some questions from our last webinar, as well as we have a bunch of questions already in the queue. But if you have questions, that you want to bring forward now, please do enter those in the question box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Today we have with us, as we were queuing up earlier, we have Andrew Shikiar and David Turner with us from the FIDO Alliance, who gave presentations earlier today. We also have Pedro Martinez from Thales, who's an SME in the space, to help answer questions as well. And unfortunately, Christiaan from Google wasn't able to make it today, but we will put him on the hook to do a Q&A very, very soon. So let's get started. So with the introduction of passkeys, and David touched on this in his presentation regarding terminology, just wanted to, again, clarify the types of passkeys. We know our synced passkeys and DeviceBound Passkeys. How would you recommend our audience look at these types of passkeys from a security and usability perspective?
Is that towards me?
I think it's a David question, yeah.
Okay. So the first thing to make really clear is that synced passkeys are probably the right answer for the majority of use cases. That anybody who just replaces passwords with passkeys is so far ahead of where they were that goes a long, long way. But we do recognize that there are some areas where people have a much higher risk profile. A lot of financial services areas, in government solutions, not necessarily consumer facing, but internal things. And in those cases, you may want to step things up a little bit. And what the device-bound keys really give you is an extra signal that this is a device you've seen before, that you know what the device is, and therefore you have a higher trust in the device. But that provides, adding that capability, though, provides overhead, creates overhead to the developer. It's a more complicated process, and there's more work for the relying party to do and manage. So that's why, for most applications, the basic passkey that can be synchronized is probably going to be the right answer for you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm actively scrolling, so just give me a moment. This is one of the first questions that we got today, and we also got this question on our last webinar as well, which is around transaction signing. Are passkeys in play for transaction signing? I think, Pedro, that's a good question for you.
Sure. Yeah, indeed, we can use passkeys in order to sign transactions. The beauty of the FIDO protocol is that it's based on the signature of a challenge. And because that's the construction of the protocol, it allows us, by introducing data related to the transaction hashed with a random, to get a response that is actually going to provide a true verification of the transaction, that is going to be related, and that it's a true digital signature of that transaction. So indeed, we can. It's just a matter of manipulating the challenge in order to contain data related to a transaction that we are trying to sign.
Great, thank you, Pedro. Okay, so we talk a lot about synced passkeys and how they're available across all of your devices. So if I have a passkey on my phone, I haven't synced it anywhere. Like, I haven't used it on another device, but let's say I lose that phone, but I want to restore those passkeys or get access to those passkeys on a new device or a different device. How does that work from like just in plain language? Like, what would the user do in order to do that?
So I always hate saying it depends. It depends on who's managing the keys for you. And I say that because, just take the simplest example, if it's Google or it's Apple that's managing them for you, their account recovery flows tend to be different. They tend to be very robust. And generally, that's the process that you would go through In the same way that if you just lost your phone, you would go through a rigorous recovery process, and that same process will give you access to your keys again. So the specifics are going to vary, again, based on risk profile and some usability issues. So you're going to see variation in the user experience, but essentially it all comes down to having a good account recovery mechanism.
Right. So that's sort of assuming that the losing of the device, somehow you've lost access to that vault. So you've either lost access to iCloud Keychain or to the Google Password Manager.
Right.
But in theory, if you had an Apple ecosystem, like you had an Apple laptop, it wouldn't be an issue in that case, right? You would just be able to access the keychain from that.
Right. I was assuming if you only had a single device and lost it. If you've got two or more devices in that same ecosystem, say an iPad and an iPhone, then the recovery becomes trivial because you've already got it on your iPad. You haven't lost anything. And when you get the new iPhone, if that's what you lost, then again, you even the setting up again is a much simpler process because you can prove ownership with the iPad. So it's very easy to do the synchronizing. So when you have two or more, it becomes a much simpler process.
Yeah, I just add, I mean, that was one of the use cases for enabling sync passkeys in the first place. I think the lost device use case is overblown, doesn't happen that often, but the added device use case is pretty common. And in the past, of course, every new device, you'd have to enroll that device with each service. You'd have to, you go back to that password for each service and then opt in to enroll WebAuthn. With sync passkeys, it's there automatically. So you don't need to know the password. The RP doesn't have to keep the password front and center. So it really, sync passkeys are, perfectly suited for that added device use case.
Really agree. So we talked a lot about biometrics with regard to passkeys. Sometimes we call them platform authenticators. We do talk about biometrics. There's a few questions around, the hacking of biometrics, whether or not the, leveraging biometrics to access or unlock the use of the passkey is, a wise thing to do. So just wanted to remind folks that the biometrics used in, FIDO are kept on the device. So as David had shown in his flow of how FIDO user authentication works, the biometric or user gesture is just between the user and the authenticator. It doesn't go to the cloud or to the relying party. So I just wanted to just clarify that question because that one had come up in the flow of the questions. But also speaking of biometrics, what is from a relying party perspective, what is the recommendation for like leveraging passkeys on devices that don't have on-device biometric capabilities?
Use a PIN. That's really the answer. Just use the PIN. So essentially, whatever the device unlock capability is, that's what you use to unlock the FIDO credentials. So in general, any device that supports passkeys will require that you have some lock on the device, minimum PIN generally, and then you can usually add biometrics to that afterwards. But if you don't have biometrics or you don't want to use them, you can always use PIN.
Right, and unlock mechanisms like an Android pattern. So it isn't, at FIDO Alliance, we don't require specific modalities. It's just, it's whatever is available on the device.
The security key, of course, can also be used as well as a roaming authenticator. If you have a security key that could plug into that device, that would work as well.
Okay. Oh, is FIDO looking at PQC?
Yes.
So the question is post-quantum cryptography. This is a real question that's in there. This wasn't like me just cueing you for this question.
Oh, wow.
But are we taking any steps to be ready for PQC?
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely yes. We actually just published a couple of weeks back a white paper outlining what our approach will be to dealing with post-quantum. Of course, we're still years away from the potential impact of this, but given the long life of protocols on the web, and the fact that post-quantum or quantum computers are specifically hurt or can be used against asymmetric keys like ours, it's critical that we start looking at that today and figuring out ways that we might be able to change our protocols now to accommodate or make them friendlier, and have a plan going forward for when will we update our specifications, when will we adopt new algorithms, and so on. So absolutely, we've been working on it. We have a thing called the Board Technical Committee, and one of their projects right now is to manage that whole process throughout the FIDO Alliance.
Thank you. Andrew, I think this one could be a good one for you, which is what you talked a lot about the UX guidelines in your talk. And then, so the question is, there's a little bit of a question around the use of QR codes over Bluetooth, not from a security perspective, but from a user experience perspective. Are folks comfortable enough with this? Will they be surprised or abandon creating a passkey because of this? And would they, are there like accessibility, things with it? And is the FIDO Alliance looking at this and or providing guidance on how RP should educate their users about that part of the flow?
Yeah, yes to all the above. So cross-device sign-in is a tricky thing to do, but we've enabled this such that to allow people to basically create one passkey and then essentially bootstrap between devices and ecosystems. All right, so that's how you can go from, say, an Apple, an iCloud environment to an Android environment, or to a PC environment, or to password manager, whatever it might be. The cross-device sign-in enables that. It also enables other use cases. So for consoles, for kiosks, and things like that, where you literally have a passkey on your handset. Then you can go, use that passkey to sign into kiosk type applications and things like that. So that's a use case. But usability certainly is different for when you're using a QR code and there's a need to shoot it with the device than it is with a device-bound biometric. And so we're aware of that, looking at implementing and giving guidance on best practices from a UX standpoint, from an implementation standpoint, and from an accessibility standpoint. All right, so I think it's fair to look for us to give more feedback and guidance in forthcoming guidelines, but also understand that not just FIDO Alliance, but the platforms that are implementing this are also aware of associated challenges and looking at ways to optimize that user journey.
Thank you. And I think when we observe some of the interviews with some of the consumers, like the priming part of it and the explaining this is what's coming next seems to be really effective in helping folks understand that they're going to be asked to do something. Usually when the OS jumps into the situation, it can cause some confusion.
Yeah.
So, okay. So for the service provider perspective, Pedro, so like a bank, for example, if they're wanting to roll out passkeys, and I'm only using the bank as an example because the question did. What control do they have over the passkeys? So two parts of it, like, can they dictate whether the passkey can or has been synced? And two, are they able to control the types of authenticator, and not authenticators, but like the modality of the authenticator to be used to unlock? Like if they don't want PINs, but they prefer biometrics, are those options for service providers today?
Well, first of all, if a reliant party wants to use platform authenticators, by default they do not have control on whether those passkeys are going to be synchronized or not. This is something that is going to be depending on the platform. No? and so it will not be under control. A bank, to follow the example that you were giving, Megan, that wants to have full control over their passkeys, they can be implementing passkey support, for example, within their own mobile application, and have the FIDO protocol implemented within their own mobile app, and then they can have full control and they can decide. So they can decide if they want to support, for example, only device-bound passkeys. That is an option that a bank can have, but that's something that they can do within the confine of their own mobile app. But if they are relying on platform passkeys, they will be using sync passkeys or device-bound passkeys depending on what is supported on the respective platform. So when it is a business to consumer, when it's a consumer service, you cannot have control over the platforms that your users have. Hence, you cannot have full control on whether passkeys will be or not.
Thank you. You just walked me into the next question by mentioning applications. So there is the notion of device-bound passkeys within applications. And there's a question I think Jen had brought up in the Q&A about this, which we haven't talked much about. So could someone explain what I mean by that, and what specification that comes from, and also like, again, reiterate like how that gives RPs maybe more control.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I wasn't sure.
So I'm talking. Do you know? Well, we're talking about So FIDO UAF is what we're talking about. Sorry, should have been a little more clear. But the definition of passkeys does include FIDO UAF under the device-bound category.
Go ahead, Pedro.
No, what I was going to say is that indeed, when you're implementing the FIDO stack on a mobile app, you can get within the app the full management of the generation of the passkey. You can still benefit from the secure storage resources within the device, and you can be storing the secret, you can be storing the private key within the device where that application is running, without declaring it as a passkey. So from the perspective of the app, the service provider has two options. They can delegate to the OS the management of the passkey to the OS, and in that case, it will be a sync passkey. It will be a sync passkey, or they can manage within the app the generation of that credential, but still use the secure storage within the device to store the secret and to protect the secret. But the OS is not going to identify that secret as a passkey. It's not going to be managing like that, and hence it's not going to synchronize it. And this way, we can ensure that that passkey will remain device bound in the mobile.
Thank you. I just put a link in our chat. So Andrew, I think everyone could take a look at this and answer this question. Actually, let me put the link. Nobody in the audience knows what I'm talking about, so
oh, cool.
I can push this to the whole audience.
What's this?
So the question is, and you'll see, and I'm sending this to everybody with the link. So will passkeys have meaningful user adoption in 2024? And I think this is like a little bit of an online poll that they did. But the question is really, how do you, and Andrew, this is a good question for you. I think you touched on this during your presentation, but how is the FIDO Alliance measuring progress and or success with regard to passkey adoption?
Yeah, so the answer to this question is yes. So go ahead, and it looks like it's a wagering site, which I'm okay with. We can wager on our success. So yes, I think we will see meaningful adoption in 2024 and beyond. But your question's the right one, Megan, which is how do we measure success? So, we talked about over 10 billion user accounts having the ability to use a passkey. That's a great start. And that is a data point, but ultimately we're looking for two things. One, which is the availability of passkey sign-ins. We want to see, the majority of, the top sites giving consumers the option to use a passkeys or sign-in. But then even more critically, those that are giving the option, making sure that consumers are actually utilizing it. All right, so percentage of addressable users using passkeys. And those are metrics that we're looking to track. So over time, we will be releasing tracking data that starts to look at things a little bit more scientifically and forensically that we'll share with the broader community to be transparent and chart FIDO's progress towards broader passkey adoption.
Thank you. And I think you had said during your Authenticate keynote was also when people are using more passkeys and passwords, which is a little bit less measurable, but it's still a good place to be.
Yeah. So in Authenticate, we talked about we get the question all the time, like, when will we be beyond passwords? Right. I don't think we're ever gonna get rid of every password, but question is, when will the passwordless future really be upon us? And I think that is the tipping point. Right now, like we talked about, passwords are the default sign-in method, and they have been forever. And you have sophisticated risk engines and anomaly detectors and things like that don't really think twice about accepting a password. But as passkeys become more and more prevalent, and become the default, all of a sudden using a password will be anomalous in and of itself. And I think that's when we'll be in the passwordless future, when using a password is rightfully seen as a high risk and anomalous action.
So thank you. So with regard to deploying, there have been some mentions of leveraging another factor on top of a passkey in certain scenarios. So the question is, as the FIDO Alliance, we advocate for phishing resistant authentication. We have passkeys. Why would we say putting in SMS OTP on top of a passkey is, an appropriate thing to do right now? Like, are there use cases where that might be a viable way to move forward with passkeys today?
Passkey plus OTP, Megan?
Yeah.
Look, I think that's not ideal, but it certainly is better than a password plus OTP, right? When fundamentally, we need to de-risk things. And passwords and OTPs are inherently risky. Anything knowledge-based, anytime you're sending a knowledge-based credential over the network, could be fake, could be ripped off, it could be spoofed. And so, possession-based approach that is inherent in passkeys is much more secure. So there are some scenarios where someone may need to have a second factor that is outside the passkey itself, where passkey plus OTP may be a short-term answer. Ultimately, I think OTPs need to go by the way of the password, which is in the rubbish bin, but that'll take some time for us to get there. But even before then, passkeys in and of themselves, by most standards and most compliance regimes, are fully sufficient to meet all 2FA or all MFA requirements. So passkey plus OTP shouldn't be necessary, but in a scenario where it is, it's much stronger than the prior approach, which is password plus OTP.
Yeah, and I think it's important to sort of think about it it's not providing the same mechanism in that case. So as Pedro had mentioned, as a relying party, the controls that you have over the passkeys are, they're coming in from the provider. And so in the case of a passkey, you know it's phishing resistant, but if you want to take an extra step in some scenarios where it might be a sensitive application with sensitive data or transactions, the OTP is providing a little bit of proof of possession as opposed to being like the authentication mechanism. So I think that's an important distinction for using like that factor. It's not really another factor, but it's actually just like a possession point to add assurance to that sign in.
And a possible case for the usage of the comment, or where a relying partner can see or can have the will of using a combination like that, is in the case of sync passkeys. If you have a service provider that implements on top of strong authentication based on passkeys, they have some risk-based authentication, and they are capturing signals on the device. They can be systematically applying that risk-based authentication to take a fingerprint of the device. So if they detect that a passkey is being used for the first time on a given device, they may be tempted, depending on their policy, on their security policy, to get an extra step for authentication in order to feel confident that there is. And after that has been used, the second time that we use, it will already be a recognized device. But again, that's especially for service providers, like in banking, that may be combining risk-based authentication as well for certain type of usages. That could be a case.
Yeah, and there's other ways of getting that second signal as well. And so it sounds like in that use case, maybe an OTP would be uniquely qualified, but generally there's other risk signals people could take. There's third parties who have device data. There's people who do location data. There's passive biometrics. There's, a litany of ways you can do something on top of a passkey that's not OTP. So I think those would be more advisable. But in the scenario where you really wish to use Passkey plus OTP, it certainly is better than a password alone.
We just have time for like maybe 2 more questions. So there are scenarios where users want to share their credential with someone, maybe they're a husband and wife, they have a bank account, that sort of thing. Is that conceptualized in the passkeys world for consumer scenarios, and/or what are our thoughts on that? Is that something that we should be encouraging? Is there a risk versus usability? Are there risk versus usability considerations there? Any thoughts on that?
I think we should jump in here.
So David, is that functionality that some of the providers are offering?
Yeah, so the whole mechanism of synchronizing and backup and restore and recovery and such is all controlled by whoever your passkey provider is. It could be, iCloud Keychain on Apple, or Google Manager, or 1Password, or Dashlane. And so all of the syncing capabilities are controlled by that vendor. One of the features that has shown up in some of the products, and Apple was the first to do this, is the ability to share a credential with somebody else. And the idea is that this is not unlike sharing your username password for, say, your Netflix account with a family member. The idea, but so it's the same idea. People are already doing it. In many cases, you have to do it because you can't, even though you have 5 people using it, you only have one set of login credentials. And the benefit of doing it this way is that you still get rid of using a password. So you create one account, you create a credential to access it, and it's safer for everybody. And they don't actually have to have a username to go or password to go with it. They've just got the credential. So in that sense, it's better than what's been going on today as far as sharing passwords themselves, because those can be stolen, phished, all the regular bad stuff. There are some concerns, though, again, in higher risk environments. There's a sense of loss of control of credentials if that's done. And so, again, depending on the product that you get, there may be rules set up about who you can share with. So for example, if you're in a corporate environment, some of the enterprise-oriented password providers may set up rules to be able to exchange credentials with fellow employees or colleagues, but not outside. So it's a capability with some real value in controlled situations.
Thank you, David. So last question has to do with, again, a little bit on the UX side. And I kind of asked this to Rue and Nick earlier as well, but a little bit more directly. A lot of consumers don't use password managers. So, and passkeys require using some sort of centralized credential manager in order to use passkeys. So is there anything being done by the FIDO Alliance, and or are we looking at how do we communicate with users early that they probably want to choose, and stick to a main credential manager before they start leveraging passkeys, or how do we ensure that they understand that aspect of passkeys? Are we looking at that at all from a research perspective, or do we have any guidance on that?
Well, the good news is that on Apple and Android Chrome, the user doesn't have to think; they're just there.
Yeah.
And so if they just use the device as it's been built and shipped, that functionality is just there for them to use. They don't need to do anything extra. Now, there are a few reasons, though, why you would want to look for a third-party provider. One of them is some people don't like to be bound to a particular ecosystem. The second is that you can't exchange credentials right now or move them between your Android device and your Apple device. And if you have both, then in my environment, I've got an Android phone, I've got an iPad, and I've got a Windows machine. And I want the passkeys available on all those devices. And so right now, the only way to do that is to use a third-party passkey provider. So it depends on the user. We already have built-in functionality in Android and Apple, but people still go to third-party passkey managers because they often provide extra features like sharing within your family or within a corporate environment and so on. As well as the cross-device capabilities. And I will add one other quick thing that there is work currently underway to help with migration between platforms as well, because it's recognized that this is a thing that people do. They switch, operating systems, they switch devices of different platforms, and pretty much everybody's agreed that we don't want to create those kinds of barriers in the market. So we're actively working on a very secure way of exchanging or moving credentials from one passkey provider to another.
I just said that more people probably use password managers than they think. So a lot of people are like, I'm going to use a password manager, but my iPhone stores everything for me. And so I think to David's point, it's maybe David's point, like Apple and Google do a great job of just making it integrated. Or we'll query people, how do you manage your passwords? Oh, my browser does it for me. Well, you're using a password manager. iCloud's a password. So a lot of people just don't recognize them as password managers, but it's a needed step. And so to your other question, yeah, we've done some research on that, and that was some of the guidance in the initial UX guidelines is how to articulate this to people. So I think it's there probably more people. There's probably a fair amount of people who are not aware they're using one, but they actually are. And then of course everything David said is true as well. Like the passkeys are never meant to be the remit of just the big platforms, and we're so happy to see all the password manager companies taking part in FIDO Alliance, with the intent of, these companies aren't password managers, they're credential managers, and passkeys are another credential, and they bring a lot of benefits in the way they do business. In fact, one thing we've always talked about the FIDO sign-in experience is that it should be a password manager-like experience without passwords. Where it's just automatically there. You don't have to think too much about it. And it's highly secure. And that's really what we're trying to do in one ecosystem or across ecosystems. And password managers help make that happen.
That's a good point. I think we have our UX research, but then we also do just consumer research. And we have seen that folks don't consider themselves to be using a password manager when they're using the OS password manager. They just think it's like a browser autofill feature. And so I think it's just a terminology thing that we have to just get through, and maybe we'll just have to redefine how we're talking about these things. But, you know, it is, I think you're right. I think most people are using something today. All right, so with that, we can wrap up. We made it through most of our questions, plus questions that we had from our previous webinar. We really appreciate everyone that came today to today's summit, stayed the course. We appreciate that so much. We hope that this content was super valuable to you. I want to thank our AMA panel here, Andrew, David, and Pedro, for joining me today for this. Really appreciate your expertise on all things passkeys here. And again, you will have access to the full recording of the summit. So if you missed anything, you can always go back and watch more. Please do take the survey, and we hope to see you on a future FIDO Alliance webinar and/or Authenticate Summit. We'll see you soon. Thank you.